He said it on a Monday morning in the kitchen while I was making breakfast. Not carefully. Not with the weight that a sentence like that deserves. He said it the way he said everything he was certain about, directly, without softening, with the specific confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about the things that mattered and did not expect to be wrong about this one. He said, "I need a DNA test. Because I am not certain that baby is mine." I was standing at the counter with a bowl in my hands. I put the bowl down. I turned around. I looked at him. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked back at me with the expression of someone who has said a difficult thing and is now waiting to manage the response. I said, "Say that again." He said, "I want a DNA test. I have been thinking about it for weeks and I need to know." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "Call the clinic. I will take the test today." He had not expected that. He had expected tears or denial or the defensive anger of someone who has something to hide. He had not expected the calm, immediate agreement of a woman who knew exactly what the results would show and had already decided what she would do with them. "My name is Dara. My husband doubted the child I had carried for 9 months. I agreed to the test before he finished his sentence. And what happened after the results came back destroyed everything he thought he had. I need to tell you about Kofi before I tell you what he did. Because understanding him is the only way to understand why the doubt was not a surprise and why my response to it was not a performance. Kofi was 37. He worked in private equity, a world that rewards a particular kind of intelligence and a particular kind of confidence and that occasionally produces men who cannot distinguish between their professional judgment and their personal one. Who bring the same certainty to the office and the kitchen and do not understand why the kitchen sometimes pushes back. He was brilliant. I want to say that clearly because it matters. He was the most analytically intelligent person I had known. He could read a room, a balance sheet, a situation, faster than anyone I had encountered professionally. He had made partner at 34. He had a reputation for being right. He was also wrong about some things. He was wrong about what loyalty looked like. He confused loyalty with obedience and had spent 7 years of our marriage subtly and sometimes not so subtly punishing the distinction between the two. He was wrong about what confidence was. He thought confidence was certainty. It is not. Certainty is the performance of confidence. Real confidence is the ability to be uncertain without being destabilized. And he was wrong about me. He had spent 7 years building a specific understanding of who I was and what I was capable of, and that understanding did not survive contact with what happened in the 12 months after the Monday morning. I took the test on Monday afternoon. The clinic was efficient and professional. A cheek swab. A form. A processing time of 5 to 7 business days. I completed the process in 40 minutes and drove home and made dinner and asked Kofi about his day and listened to his answer with the full, attentive presence I had always brought to our evenings. He was slightly careful with me. Slightly monitored. The specific quality of a man who has said a significant thing and is not sure what it has set in motion. I was entirely normal. Because I was entirely certain. I knew whose baby I was carrying. I had not been with anyone other than Kofi in 7 years of marriage. The doubt he had expressed was not based on evidence. It was based on something else, something I had been watching gather in him for months without naming it because naming it would require a conversation I had not yet decided how to have. The doubt was not about paternity. It was about control. Kofi had sensed in the months of my pregnancy a shift in our dynamic that he could not fully articulate and could not tolerate. I had been changing. Not dramatically. In the specific, organic way that pregnancy changes a person, turning them inward, making them more certain of their own priorities, less available for the management of someone else's comfort. He had felt the change and had not known what to do with it. The DNA test was what he had found to do with it. The results arrived on a Friday morning. An email from the clinic. A PDF attachment. The language of the report was clinical and precise in the way that laboratories are clinical and precise, numbers and percentages and the specific vocabulary of genetic analysis. The conclusion was clear. The probability of paternity was 99.998%. I read the report twice. I printed it. I placed it in a folder in my desk drawer. Then I called my sister Yolanda. She answered immediately. I said, the results came. She said, and? I said, 99.998%. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to give him the results. And then I am going to have the conversation we have not had yet. She said, which conversation? I said, the one about why he asked for the test in the first place. She said, are you ready for that conversation? I thought about it honestly. I said, I have been ready for 6 months. I was waiting for something that made it impossible to avoid. She said, a DNA test qualifies. I said, yes. I think it does. She said, call me after. I said I would. I put the results in my bag. I waited for Kofi to come home. He came home at 7:15. I was in the living room. The results folder was on the coffee table between us. He sat down. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, the results. I said, yes. He said, and? I slid the folder across to him. He opened it. He read it. He read it again. I watched his face move through several things in the space of 30 seconds, relief, which I had expected, and something underneath the relief that I had also expected. Shame. Not performed shame. The real kind. The specific quality of a person who has done something they cannot justify in retrospect and who knows the person across from them understands this completely. He said, Dara. I said, I need you to listen before you say anything else. He said, yes. I said, those results tell you something you should have known without them. But they do not answer the question I actually need you to answer. He said, what question? I said, why did you ask for them? He looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. He said, I was not sure. I said, you were entirely sure. You have known me for 9 years. You have been married to me for 7. There was no factual basis for uncertainty. What you were uncertain about was something else entirely, and I need you to name it honestly, or this conversation cannot go anywhere useful. He was quiet for a long time. He named it. Eventually. After a silence that lasted long enough that I had almost decided the conversation was not going to produce the honesty I needed. He said, I felt like I was losing you. I said, to what? He said, to yourself. To whoever you were becoming. You were different. In the pregnancy. More certain. Less available. I said, I was growing a person. He said, I know. I know that is what was happening. But I experienced it as a withdrawal and I did not know what to do with the withdrawal except to question it. I said, you questioned my faithfulness. He said, yes. I said, because I was becoming more certain of myself. He said, I know how that sounds. I said, I need you to understand something. What you did on Monday morning, calling into question the paternity of a child I have been carrying for 9 months, in a marriage where I have given you no reason to doubt me, that is not something I can allow to be explained away by your discomfort with my certainty. Those are different categories of harm. He said, I know. I said, "Do you understand what it cost me to hear that sentence in the kitchen?" He said, "I think I am beginning to understand." I said, "Good. Because what happens next depends on the quality of your understanding." I did not leave that evening. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a particular response to what had happened, and the response I gave was not the expected one. I did not pack a bag or call my sister or deliver an ultimatum. I stayed. I had dinner. I went to bed. Because leaving was not the most powerful thing I could do in that moment. The most powerful thing I could do was stay long enough to understand whether there was something worth building on the other side of the conversation we had just had. I had given Kofi the results and the question and the framework for what came next. What came next depended on what he did with all three. He did not disappoint in the hours that followed. He did not retreat into defensiveness or find a way to reframe the situation that reduced his responsibility for it. He sat with what I had said in the way of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something difficult about themselves rather than managing their way around it. In the morning he was quiet at breakfast in a different way from his usual quiet. This was not the quiet of managed distance. It was the quiet of someone doing active work inside themselves. He said, "I need to talk to someone." "A professional." I said, "Yes. You do." He said, "I am going to call today." I said, "I think that is the right decision." He called. The appointment was the following week. The baby came 6 weeks after the Monday morning. A girl. Whole and loud and entirely herself from the first minute. We named her ESI, the name we had chosen together 4 months earlier in an evening that felt a long time ago now. Kofi was in the room. He had been there through the labor with the complete presence of someone who understood that this was not a moment he was permitted to be anywhere other than completely present. When ESI arrived, he held her. He sat in the chair beside the bed and held her and looked at her with the specific expression of a man encountering something that has reorganized everything he thought he understood. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I am sorry." Not to me. To her. In the quiet voice of someone saying something they know a 6-minute-old child cannot hear, but that needs to be said aloud regardless. I watched him say it. If this story is hitting something real for you right now, hit subscribe. I post every Sunday and I do not want you to miss what comes next. I had been angry. I want to be honest about that because the anger had been real and had lived in me through the 6 weeks between the kitchen and the delivery room. Not consuming anger, the kind that is processed alongside the ordinary work of living, that is felt and acknowledged and not allowed to become the only thing. But it had been there. Watching him hold ESI and say "I am sorry" in that quiet voice did not dissolve the anger. What it did was add something beside it. Something that the anger alone could not have made room for. The beginning of a question. Whether this was a man who could grow past what he had done. The therapy changed him. Not dramatically. Not in the sudden, visible transformation of someone who has had a single revelatory session and emerged converted. In the slow, specific way that genuine therapeutic work changes people, incrementally, with setbacks. With the particular difficulty of a man who has spent 40 years being certain encountering the therapeutic requirement to be uncertain about himself. He told me about the sessions in the evenings. Not everything, there were things that belonged to him and I did not ask for them. But the substance. The themes. The things he was discovering about the relationship between his professional certainty and his personal relationships and the way the two had been bleeding into each other in ways he had not been monitoring. He was discovering that he had treated our marriage the way he treated an investment position. As something he assessed and managed from a position of assumed superior information. That when the information did not match his model, when I began to change in the pregnancy in ways his model had not predicted, he had responded with the same corrective instinct he would have applied to a misaligned position. He had questioned the data rather than questioning the model. The DNA test had been him questioning the data. The therapy was him learning to question the model. I watched the process with the specific attention of someone who has made no decision about the outcome and is genuinely waiting to see what the evidence produces. The conversation with his mother happened in the 3rd month after ESI arrived. Kofi's mother Abina was a woman I had always loved. Warm and direct and possessed of the specific wisdom of someone who has lived long enough to have been wrong about significant things and has learned from each one. She had welcomed me into the family with completeness and had maintained that welcome through 7 years of marriage without conditions. She came to visit ESI on a Sunday. She held her the way grandmothers hold babies, with the specific ease of someone for whom this weight and warmth is deeply familiar. And then she looked at me. She said, "He told me what he did." I said, "Yes." She said, "He told me 2 weeks ago. He did not tell me before because he was ashamed. He told me when he reached the point in the therapy where he understood he needed to account for it to someone outside the marriage." I said, "I know. He told me he was going to." She said, "I want you to know that I did not raise him to do that." I said, "I know that too." She said, "And I want you to know that whatever you decide, whatever you need to do for yourself and for ESI, I will support it. Not him. You." I looked at her. She said, "My son made a serious error. The people who love him do not get to pretend otherwise just because he is the person we love." I said, "That is a very honest thing to say." She said, "It is the least I can offer you." The professional consequences arrived in the 4th month. Not from me. I had said nothing to anyone outside my immediate circle, not to colleagues, not to industry contacts, not to the network of mutual professional acquaintances that Kofi and I shared. The consequences arrived from him. From the therapy and the understanding it had produced. And from a conversation he had with his firm. He told me on a Tuesday evening that he had spoken to the managing partner. That he had disclosed that he had been managing a personal crisis that had affected his professional judgment over the previous several months. That he had requested a temporary reduction in responsibility while he addressed it. I said, "You told them voluntarily." He said, "The therapy made clear to me that I had been bringing the same judgment failures to my professional decisions that I brought to the Monday morning kitchen. There were 3 decisions in the previous quarter that I should have made differently. I needed to disclose that rather than allow it to compound." I looked at him. He said, "The managing partner was more understanding than I expected." I said, "What happens now professionally?" He said, "A supervised period. 6 months. A reduction in my portfolio. A formal check-in at the end of the period." I said, "You disclosed professional errors voluntarily because the therapy told you the errors were connected to the same thing as what you did to me." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is a significant thing to do." He said, "It was the honest thing to do." I said, "I know. That is why it is significant. I want to tell you about the conversation Kofi and I had in the 6th month. Not because it was dramatic, it was not. Not because it produced a decision, it produced the beginning of a direction, which is different. But because it was the most honest conversation we had had in 7 years of marriage, and I think that deserves to be told. We were in the garden after ESI was asleep. It was warm. The kind of evening that invites long conversations. I said, "I need to tell you what the Monday morning cost me." He said, "Tell me." I said, "It cost me the certainty I had about who you were. I had built 7 years on a specific understanding of you, and the kitchen table dismantled it in 1 sentence. Not because you were wrong about the paternity, you were wrong about that. But because you were capable of saying it. Because you had been carrying that thought for weeks without telling me. Because you had managed a private doubt about the most fundamental thing in our marriage rather than bringing it to me. He said, I know. I said, management is not communication. That is what the previous 7 years had been, management. You managing your assessments of me and the marriage from a position of assumed superior information. And I had allowed that. I had made myself available to be managed rather than requiring genuine partnership. He said, you are not responsible for my failures. I said, no. But I am responsible for what I allowed to develop around them. He said, what do you want now? I said, genuine partnership. Actual uncertainty shared as it happens. No more management. He said, I want that too. I said, then we have something to build on. The firm's supervised period ended after 6 months. The managing partner called Kofi in and told him the review had been positive. That the 3 decisions he had disclosed had been examined and found to be within acceptable error parameters, significant enough to require disclosure but not significant enough to represent a pattern of misconduct. That the supervised period had been handled with the professionalism and transparency that the firm respected. He was reinstated to full responsibility. He came home that evening and told me. He did not celebrate it, he received it in the specific way of someone who understands that reinstatement is not vindication, it is simply the conclusion of an accounting. He had made errors. He had disclosed them. The disclosure had been handled and the handling had been fair. That was the complete picture. I said, how do you feel? He said, accountable. In a way I was not before. I said, that is different from how you usually feel. He said, yes. I used to feel certain. Accountable is better. I said, yes. It is. ESI was in her chair making the specific sounds she made when she wanted attention. Kofi picked her up. She grabbed his finger with the complete, trusting grip of a 7-month-old and he looked at her with the expression he had had in the delivery room, the one that had reorganized everything. I watched him with her. I thought, this is what the Monday morning made possible. Not by being acceptable. By being the thing that was so unacceptable it required both of us to become something different. Yolanda came to dinner in the 8th month. She had been my closest witness through everything, the Monday morning, the results, the delivery room, the therapy months, the professional disclosure, the 6th month conversation in the garden. She sat at our table and ate the food we had cooked and held ESI with the confident ease of an aunt who has already decided she is the favorite and is simply waiting for ESI to agree. After dinner she found me in the kitchen. She said, he is different. I said, yes. She said, different how? I thought about it. I said, less certain. More present. He asks questions now instead of making assessments. He says I am not sure about something in the first conversation rather than the 4th. He holds the uncertainty rather than managing it. She said, and you? I said, I am more honest. About what I need. About when something is not working. About the management dynamic I was participating in. She said, you are both different. I said, yes. We are. She said, is that what you wanted? I thought about the Monday morning. The bowl in my hands. The certainty of the results. The question I had asked him that evening about what the doubt was really about. I said, I wanted honesty. I wanted a real marriage rather than a managed one. The path to that was not the one I would have chosen. She said, but it got you there. I said, it got us there. Both of us. That is the part that matters. I want to tell you what the DNA test was. Not scientifically. I know what it was scientifically. I want to tell you what it was in the life of our marriage because I think that is the more important thing. It was the moment the management became visible. For 7 years Kofi had been managing me and the marriage from a position of assumed superior information. He had made assessments and reached conclusions and operated from those conclusions without subjecting them to the test of honest conversation. And I had allowed it, had made myself available to be managed, because the marriage was otherwise good and the dynamic was subtle and the cost of naming it had always seemed higher than the cost of living within it. The DNA test was what happened when the management produced a result so visible it could no longer be managed. He had thought something about me that was wrong. He had carried that thought for weeks without sharing it. And then he had expressed it not as an honest disclosure of his uncertainty but as a demand. I need a DNA test that placed the burden of proof on me rather than the burden of honesty on him. That was the management. At its most visible. At its most wrong. And because it was visible, because it was so concrete and so undeniable, it became the thing that made the conversation possible that 7 years of subtlety had prevented. I am not grateful for it. But I have made my peace with what it produced. ESI turned 1. We had a small celebration. Family. Close friends. The people who had been present through the year in one way or another and who deserved to be present for the milestone. Abina came. She held ESI the entire afternoon with the specific possession of a grandmother who has decided her grandchild is the most important person in any room and is simply waiting for everyone else to agree. Yolanda came. She brought a gift that was entirely too large for a 1-year-old and entirely right for the aunt who gave it. Kofi's closest friend from university came. A man named Dex who had always had the quality of knowing more than he said and saying exactly what he knew when it mattered. He shook my hand when he arrived and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires and looked at me with the expression of someone who knows the year that has just passed and wants to acknowledge it without making it the center of the afternoon. I received the acknowledgement. I moved on. At the end of the afternoon after everyone had left and ESI was asleep, Kofi and I sat in the garden in the same chairs we had sat in for the 6th-month conversation. He said, "Thank you for staying." I said, "I stayed because there was something worth staying for." He said, "I know. I am grateful you could see it when I could not." I said, "You found it eventually." He said, "I had help." I said, "Yes. Good help is the thing that makes the difference." The professional world found out in the 9th month. Not from me. Not from Kofi directly. From the specific osmosis of information in close professional communities, a comment made, a connection drawn, a colleague who knew someone who had heard something and had put pieces together. The version that circulated was incomplete and slightly wrong in the specific way that versions of private things are always incomplete and slightly wrong when they move through professional networks. It had the DNA test. It had the paternity doubt. It did not have the therapy or the professional disclosure or the 6th-month garden conversation or ESI's birthday. 2 people contacted me directly. Professional contacts who felt they knew me well enough to reach out. Both were careful and kind and genuinely concerned. I thanked both of them. I said the situation had been handled within the marriage and that I was well and ESI was well and I appreciated their concern. I said nothing about Kofi. I said nothing about the specifics of what had happened or what had followed. I did not owe the professional network a full account. The people who deserved the full account had received it. One of the contacts, a woman named Petra who I had known for 8 years, said something in her message that stayed with me. She said, "I hope whatever happened has produced something worth the cost of getting through it." I wrote back, "It has. I am certain of that." I meant it. Kofi's therapy continued into the 2nd year. Not at the same frequency, he had moved from weekly to fortnightly to monthly as the work had progressed and the most significant things had been addressed. But continuing. The specific commitment of someone who has understood that the work does not end when the crisis ends. He asked me once, in the 14th month, on an evening when ESI was asleep and we were in the kitchen the way we were always in the kitchen, the ordinary domestic space where significant things seemed to happen between us, whether I had ever considered leaving. I said, yes. In the weeks after the Monday morning before the results came, I had a conversation in my head about what leaving would look like and what staying would require and which of the two was possible. He said, and? I said, staying required something that I was not certain you were capable of. And leaving required something I was not certain the marriage deserved. He said, what did staying require? I said, exactly what you have been doing for 14 months. The therapy. The professional disclosure. The 6th-month conversation. The consistent, daily, unglamorous work of becoming someone who does not manage a marriage from the inside of his own certainty. He said, and what did leaving require? I said, the certainty that the marriage could not produce what I needed. And I did not have that certainty in the weeks after the Monday morning. I had anger and grief and the specific hurt of someone who has been fundamentally doubted. But I did not have certainty. He said, I am glad you did not have it. I said, so am I. But I want you to understand something. My staying is not a forgiveness that erases what happened. It is a choice made every day. And it requires every day to be earned. He said, I know. I intend to earn it. I went back to work in the 15th month. I had been on maternity leave since ESI arrived, an extended leave that I had negotiated before the pregnancy and that I had been grateful for in ways I had not fully anticipated. The year of leave had given me time to process everything that the Monday morning had set in motion and to arrive at the professional world again from a place of genuine readiness rather than exhausted obligation. My firm had kept my role. My clients had maintained their relationships with the firm while I was away, and several of them had sent messages in the months of my leave that told me the relationships were holding. My first week back I had 5 client calls. 4 of them went exactly as I had expected. The 5th was with a client I had worked with for 3 years, a careful, exacting woman named Dr. Sable who had the specific quality of knowing when something had shifted in the people she worked with. She said midway through the call, you sound different. I said, different how? She said, more certain. Like someone who knows something now that she did not know before. I thought about that for a moment. I said, I think that is accurate. She said, what do you know now? I said, I know what I will not accept. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. She said, no. It is the most important thing. We moved on to the work. I want to tell you about the 2nd year. Not the dramatic things, the Monday morning and the test and the results and the delivery room and the therapy and the professional disclosure. The ordinary 2nd year. The one that came after all of those things, and that was, in its ordinariness, the evidence that something had been built. ESI at 13 months discovering walking with the complete commitment of someone who has identified an objective and intends to achieve it on her own terms regardless of the number of times the floor gets in the way. Kofi at 41 learning to say I am not sure about this to his team at work in the specific way of someone who has understood that a leader's uncertainty is not a weakness to be managed but a condition to be shared. Sunday evenings in the garden. Not the charged, significant conversations of the first year. The ordinary ones. About the week. About ESI. About small things and medium things and occasionally the large things that required the kind of honesty the first year had required them both to practice. A marriage that was not the one they had before the Monday morning. Better. More honest. More difficult in the ways that genuine things are difficult and easier in the ways that genuine things are easier when the difficulty is shared rather than managed. Not a happy ending in the way of movies, because marriages are not movies and happy is not a destination. A continuing. Deliberate and honest and alive. That was enough. That was more than enough. Abina asked me in the 18th month what I had learned from the year. We were at her house for a Sunday lunch. Kofi was in the garden with ESI, who had recently discovered that grass was an acceptable surface to eat and was being gently redirected by her father. Abina and I were in the kitchen. She asked the question in the direct way she always asked the significant questions, without preamble, without managing the approach, simply the question when the moment was right. I thought about it honestly. I said, I learned that certainty is not safety. I had believed for 7 years that Kofi's certainty was one of the things that made the marriage safe. It was not safety. It was the absence of genuine uncertainty shared. And the absence of shared uncertainty is the absence of genuine partnership. She said, and now? I said, now we are uncertain together. It is less comfortable and more true. She said, more true is worth the discomfort. I said, yes. Every time. She said, he is working very hard. I said, I know. She said, and you? I said, I am working too. At honesty. At naming what I need before it becomes a grievance. At not making myself smaller to accommodate his model of who I am. She said, that is the harder work. I said, yes. It is the work I should have been doing for 7 years. She said, you are doing it now. I said, yes. Both of us. That is what makes the difference. The DNA results are in a folder in my desk drawer. I have not looked at them since the Friday morning they arrived. I do not need to look at them. They said what I knew they would say, and they produced the conversation that needed to happen, and they have served their purpose. But I have not thrown them away. Not as insurance. Not as evidence I might need. I have a different relationship with documentation than that. I do not keep things because I might need to deploy them. I keep things because they are part of the record of what happened, and the record matters. The record is this. A Monday morning in a kitchen. A sentence delivered without softening. A woman who put down her bowl and said, call the clinic. I will take the test today. 5 to 7 business days. A Friday morning email with a PDF attachment. 99.998%. A folder on a coffee table. A man reading it. A question asked. 6 months of therapy. A professional disclosure. A 6th-month garden conversation. A delivery room. A 1-year-old birthday party in a garden. A 2nd year of ordinary Sundays. All of it in the record. All of it the complete picture of a year that cost something real and produced something real, and that I would not rewrite even though I would not choose to live through it again. The record is what it is. It does not need my commentary. It simply needs to be kept. ESI is 18 months old now. She walks with the specific confidence of someone who has entirely mastered the objective and has moved on to the next challenge, which appears to be climbing things that were not designed to be climbed. She is opinionated about food and unequivocal about her preferences, and has the laugh of someone who has found the world to be a reliable source of delight. She looks like both of us. The specific combination of features that happens when two people have been together long enough for the question of who she resembles to produce different answers depending on the moment and the lighting. She does not know about the Monday morning. She will not know for many years. When she is old enough to understand what happened, when she asks the questions that children ask when they are old enough to ask them, I will tell her honestly and completely. I will tell her that her father doubted her before she arrived. That he was wrong. That the results told him he was wrong in a form he could not argue with. That what he did with being wrong was the thing that mattered. I will tell her that being wrong is not the end of anything. Being wrong and unwilling to understand why is the end of things. Being wrong and doing the work to understand it, that is the beginning of something. I will tell her that her parents built something in the year she arrived that they could not have built before it. That she was not the reason they built it, the Monday morning was the reason they built it. But she was present for the building and that makes her part of it in a way that is entirely her own. Kofi asked me in the 20th month what I needed. Not in the managed way he used to ask it, as an assessment question, as a way of gathering information he would then process privately and address in the way he decided was best. In the genuine way. The way of someone who has learned that the question is not a data collection exercise but an invitation to be heard. I said, I need you to keep asking me that question. He said, what question? I said, this one. What do you need? Asked honestly. At regular intervals. Before I have to ask you to ask it. He said, I can do that. I said, I know. You have been doing it for 8 months. He said, I want to keep doing it. I said, then do. He said, what else? I thought about it. I said, I need us to keep having the conversations that are uncomfortable to start. The ones we would both rather manage around. I need us to agree that the uncomfortable ones are the important ones and that we do not get to skip them. He said, agreed. I said, and I need you to keep being uncertain where you are uncertain. The certainty was never the thing I needed from you. I needed a partner. Partners are uncertain together. He said, I know that now. I said, I know you do. He reached across and put his hand over mine. The specific gesture of someone who has learned that presence is more important than management. I turned my hand over and held his. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The table was the same table. We were not the same people. Better. Both of us. And still building. People ask me sometimes what I would say to the woman standing at the kitchen counter on a Monday morning with a bowl in her hands. I would say, put the bowl down. Not dramatically. Not in preparation for a confrontation. Simply, put the bowl down. Because what is about to happen requires both hands and your full attention, and the bowl is not going to help. I would say, the sentence he is about to say is going to cost you something. The specific cost of being fundamentally doubted by the person who is supposed to know you best. Let the cost be what it is. Do not reduce it or manage it or reframe it into something more bearable than it is. It is what it costs. Feel it fully. And then I would say yes to the test. Immediately. Before he finishes his sentence if you can. Because your certainty is your power in this moment, and the most powerful expression of that certainty is the willingness to prove it without hesitation. I would say, the results will come on a Friday morning. They will say what you know they will say. And then there will be a question you need to ask him. Not about the paternity, that is answered. About the doubt. What the doubt was really about. Ask it that evening. Without anger. With the clear, direct language of someone who requires an honest answer. The answer will come. Not quickly. But it will come. And what comes after the answer is what will determine everything. My name is Dara. My husband said the baby was not his. The DNA results came back at 99.998%. He lost more than he expected in the weeks that followed. And built more than either of us imagined. The results did not lie. They never do.